have a little change in the program because our main speaker, Dr. Francis Owaka from the University of Nairobi, actually was not let board the plane to come here. And that only happened like a day ago. And he called me from the airport of Nairobi and he said that the immigration is not letting him leave the country. Which is very interesting because it kind of shows that these elections, there's something going on in Kenya. And when it comes to the issues of fraud and telling what really happened. And we were wondering at that time, is this personal? Is it something that people know that he's going to come to talk here about the election, or is it more general? There is a note from the Chief of Staff and Head of Public Service, Mr. Kuria, who has sent travel outside the country in Kenya. And this is a circulation for government offices, and it says that this is to notify you that it has been decided under further advice otherwise, no government official will travel outside the country without clearance by the president. And this said government officials. There shouldn't be question about university lecturers or academics or professors. And Francis had cleared his travel. He had a visa, everything, already boarding on the plane. He has cleared his travel with his vice chancellor, University of Nairobi, who also, I think very recently might have got hold of this circulation and say, well, it's not for us, it's not for the university. However, the immigration appears to take this order very seriously, and there is a note by hand, I don't know by whom, saying, please ensure full compliance to this order. And it sees that the immigration, at least at the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi, is taking this very seriously. So therefore, our main speaker is not here with us today. I was online with him a little while ago, and we were hoping, and we are still hoping, that maybe he can join us by Skype for a few minutes, give some comments, but we are not quite sure. The connections haven't been working, and frustrated what happened to him, and his inability to travel here. He said, I'm taking off to the village, and now it's raining in the village, and the connection is not so good. So we are still kind of hoping to hear something from him. But nevertheless, even if he's not here, we have another expert, our own Sjögren, who just also came back from Kenya. He was there during the elections, and he's been working a lot on Kenyan election and political systems. And we will have him here to give some analysis. I myself, I lived 6 years or so in Kenya, working there for the Embassy of Finland, and also working a lot with the University of Nairobi. I was there during the 2007 elections, and I've been there ever since, you know, annually visiting and keeping in touch and working also on Kenyan political situation. So we hope that we can give you a good kind of presentation, what is going on, and then we would like to hear from you and have a very interactive session on this. And this is very timely also because just today the Supreme Court gave the final judgment on why they annulled the Kenyan elections. Now, before I go into introduction more detailed, I want to ask you, how many of you have been following Kenyan elections, who know more or less what's going on there? I mean, I assume that most of you are here of the interest to the Kenyan election. So we don't have to go so detailed, but I think what is interesting is why so much interest in Kenyan elections now this year and what is happening. And the Supreme Court today gave that final judgment, very detailed. It was about an hour and a half, 2 hours long. We had it earlier here. You can also listen it online if you want to.
They're still reading, I think.
Are they still finishing?
Yes.
Last I saw.
Yes.
They might be still finishing. Anyway, it's online and you can get it online. And we can see from there. But some of the main points which Anders is going to talk or tell you more in detail was how the independent electoral and boundary commissions actually failed. ICT system failed, the commission failed, and biggest thing, the Commission didn't comply in the court's order to give all the information regarding to the ICT system and accused hacking of the system. But how did we get there? So very short background is, like we know, Kenya had general elections on August 8th, and it was actually 6 different elections, because it was according to the 2011 fairly new constitution. It was the presidential elections, it was the county governors elections, senators elections, members of parliament, county women representatives, plus also the members of the county assemblies. So there's quite a few people who were candidates who were taking part in the election. And even the process itself and the ballot papers and getting all this right was fairly complicated. And there was a high number of votes that had to be rejected because they were not filled properly. And why this time so much interest even before the elections? I mean, even us, we were contacted by media, mostly by the Nordic media. How is it going to go? What's going to happen? Is there going to be violence? Is Kenya going to manage these elections? Very much interest. And I think partly, now it's 10 years for 2007 elections. 2007 elections, which led to post-election violence. Over 1,000 people lost their lives. Almost 500,000 were displaced in the country. And lots of ethnic polarization, violence, hate speech, coalition government built after that, trying to build the ethnic and kind of trust, and also the trust to the institutions. We don't go into details of those elections now, but if they come in the discussion, we can talk more in detail. 2013 were the next elections under the new constitutions. The 2007 elections actually led to the new constitutions that it was finally passed, and it's very progressive constitution in Africa, and it was supposed to solve some of the problems that were very evident in Kenya before the 2007 elections. It's supposed to dissolve a little bit the power to the county levels, take away some of the centered of the power to the president, and have more checks and balances, and various other progressive changes in the old constitution. 2013 elections were also contested and taken into a court, but that petition was rejected by the courts. It was not seemed to have enough evidence to warrant for annulment of those elections. Now, after that, the situation in Kenya has been since that there's been growing discontent on the issues of corruption, bad governance, security issues. There's been lots of terrorist attacks, terrorism threat in the country. There's been continuing poverty. There hasn't been any really more equality, social justice between the people, and rising food prices, especially during early this year, last year, unemployment, and many promises that the president 2013 had said he'll take care of have not been fulfilled. So people were very anxious about these elections, and there were expectations for change. And also, traditionally, Kenya has been voting quite along with the ethnic alliances and ethnic lines. And this year, 2017, it seems like the balance was quite even. The president and vice president, who are coming from the two biggest ethnic groups in Kenya, from Kikuyu and from Kalenjin, from Rift Valley, against Raila Odinga's Western Kenya Luos, Luyas, and various other ethnic groups were together. So it looked like if the elections are free and fair, the numbers will be quite close. We wouldn't necessarily know who is going to win if the elections are free and fair. And it's all about numbers in Kenya, and we can discuss about later also about the ethnic line of voting and the lack of ideologies and how people cast their votes. Now, Anders will tell more about how it was in Kenya during the elections, but we've seen from papers that the election day itself went fairly well. People were waiting in line to vote. Some irregularities happened, observed issues with the polling stations, getting the materials there in time, problems with assisting the voting, potentially some intimidations, and even before the elections there were accusations one way or another. And the opposition had said that we should win this time unless there is rigging, and we will not lose these elections. Now, after that, the problems began again, same as 2007, when the results were transmitted. There seemed to have been.
The pig.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. This is about people lining to vote and really committed, and that's what I really admire about Kenyans. They are very committed to use their democratic right to vote, even despite the problems that have been there. Yet again, they say now we vote and we say who we want to be our rulers.
Results coming in.
Yeah. And this is about, yes, the results coming in, and the problem in the transmission and certain kind of statistical impossibilities that Uhuru Kenyatta, the incumbent candidate, kept on being 10% ahead throughout the vote counting and yeah.
I think that's
let's discuss that later. But that's just one thing that seemed to appear throughout the transmissions. And after that is the last thing. Then I move to Anders, which is I think I also would like to discuss more in detail, was whether the international observers were too fast to give their first judgment, saying that the elections are free and fair, at least credible enough. And that's been debated a lot yet again in Kenya. Are there just different standards to free and fairness in elections in, let's say, EU countries or in African countries and elsewhere? And how does this work? And what is the role of the international observers? Now they have taken a little bit back and said that, well, we just said that the election day was free and fair. What we saw, mostly small irregularities, don't count. That's another question. Don't the small irregularities count or not? Anyway, so now to today. Okay, and then Raila Odinga and the NGOs several NGOs took the petition to the court, and they challenged the results of these elections. And to the surprise of many, the Supreme Court annulled the elections. And today they gave their profound and full judgment why they did that. But I'll leave this introduction here, and I'll move to Anders now, and we return to these topics in our discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Sirkku. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to see so many of you here. I'm going to do what I normally don't do, namely apologize in advance for being not prepared, but this time I feel I have good reasons for doing that. I hope it will work out anyway. As Sirkku indicated, very short notice, we both of us had to step up and step in. So we just found out yesterday that Francis unfortunately wouldn't be able to attend. So we haven't had a lot of time to prepare what we're going to say now, but I hope it will make sense. And if nothing else, there will be a lot of topics for the Q&A and discussions. Now, what I will say now will set out from the 1st of September. That is the first ruling by the Supreme Court, and will center on what has happened since and what may happen now, what should happen and what may happen. Obviously, it's very difficult to forecast things, things are moving very rapidly and in some ways unpredictably. And again, I think that might be good topics for a discussion and Q&A. I will start with that ruling then. Obviously, it was a true game changer. It was very unexpected to most. Not in the sense that the opposition necessarily had a weak case. I think many made the assessment that they had a fairly strong case, stronger than last time. But of course, the prediction was that there would be political pressure on the court, so that in the end, the amount of evidence and arguments wouldn't be decisive. But to everyone's surprise, the majority of the Supreme Court decided to annul the elections. And just to repeat for those of you who are not aware and perhaps don't have it in fresh memory, the judges were to answer 4 questions. First one, whether the 2017 presidential election was conducted in accordance with the principles laid down in the Constitution and the law relating to elections. 2, whether there were irregularities and illegalities committed in the conduct of the 2017 presidential election. 3, if there were irregularities and illegalities, what was their impact, if any, on the integrity of the election? 4, what consequential orders, declarations and reliefs should this court grant, if any? Now, the brief ruling without motivations answered the first 3 of those. As to orders, declarations and reliefs, we'll just have to wait and read the full ruling. As I indicated, it's still ongoing at the Supreme Court, at least when I left 5 minutes to 3, I think it was Justice Ojwang which read his dissenting ruling at the time. But as you know, to the first 3 questions, the majority of the Supreme Court answered essentially, yes, there were irregularities and illegalities committed by the IBC, and those were significant enough to impact on the integrity of the election, and that was the basis. Now, ever since that ruling, everything in Kenyan politics has, of course, been conditioned by it, and all focus is on the fresh election. So what I will talk about now is not the content of the ruling. I would need, as everyone would, need to read and digest the full ruling in order to speak more authoritatively about it. I will speak about what has happened since that ruling politically and what can we expect about the forthcoming elections. Now, on the forthcoming presidential election, because that is what's going to take place, the other elections haven't been annulled. There are separate processes for petition, the parliamentary and gubernatorial, etc. elections. All of these will have to be petitioned separately through different mechanisms, and a lot of them will be. I'll come back to that. But what's going to happen within 60 days of that ruling is fresh presidential election. Many uncertainties about it. Who exactly will organize it? Under which framework and when? Those issues remain unresolved, and the contending parties, that is the Jubilee Party in government and the NASA political alliance in the opposition, have very different views about this. Some things, but not all, may become clearer after today's Supreme Court ruling, in which the spelled out reasons for the decisions decision is given. A number of processes have been put on hold, waiting for this ruling. The IBC, to start with, has said, that is the Independent Electors Boundaries Commission, the Electoral Commission, IBC. The IBC has said it will have to wait for this judgment until they conduct any changes, if any at all. The Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions has said the same. They will have to wait for the judgment before they can order any investigations against any individual at the IBC suspected of electoral offences. Diplomats, observers, everyone has been waiting. And everyone will seek to justify their case by drawing on aspects of the rule. Unless there are, and I'm not familiar in detail with what sort of orders and declarations the court might give, but to a big extent, this judgment can boost but not decide. It can provide arguments but not directives to a large extent. What that means is that, yes, the court may come to certain conclusions, but that does not necessitate any particular political resolution. Now, if the majority ruling is a damning indictment of the IBC, NASA's case will be strengthened considerably among its supporters, but most certainly also among external actors. On the other hand, Jubilee has spent the last few weeks spending a lot of energy demonizing the Supreme Court. Now, initially, Uhuru Kenyatta said he disagreed with but accepted the ruling. However, on the same day, here is a picture from a meeting on that same afternoon in a market in Burma Market in Nairobi, where he spoke to the public. He began to insult the judges by calling them wakora, which in Kiswahili is thugs, wondering how 4 thugs could stand in the way of the will of the people. In subsequent speeches, he promised he would deal with the judiciary once he was re-elected. MPs and senators voiced plans to change the constitution to trim the judiciary. One MP wrote a petition to remove the Chief Justice. Now, this campaign intensified ahead of the ruling, probably with the aim of intimidating judges to write a soft ruling, or, if that would not happen, to be able to reject the ruling and the court as illegitimate and partisan. One NGO based in Mombasa petitioned the Judicial Service Commission to remove 2 of the judges on the basis of being partisan. And yesterday, demonstrations were held outside the Supreme Court. You can see here, recount the votes, Uhurutu Tanutena, that is another 5 for Uhuru and Rutu, another 5 years. And you can see there with a hashtag, Wakora Network. Wakora is the word I referred to, the thugs, right? Judiciary equals evil society. Just a word on that. Evil society was a spin that some government bloggers came up with in relation to the petition on the 2013 elections as a pet name for civil society. They rebranded it evil society because they argue that a certain group of civil society organizations work together with the opposition and certain donors in order to subvert Kenyan politics and to overthrow the government. So those are evil societies, a fairly frequently used term by certain actors in Kenya, and it's fairly well known. And they are trying to drag the judiciary into this, claiming, and that was the basis of one of the petitions, that saying there is a network which involves key actors in the judiciary that is held captive by these activists in civil society. So you can see the demonization of the judiciary that's going on. So this demonstration prompted the Chief Justice to come out on the stairs of the Supreme Court and make a public pronouncement where he defended the independence of the judiciary against attack from politicians. And he, in response to that, a leading senator on the government side, Kipchumba Murkomen, came out and accused here is the proof, the CJ has now turned into an opposition politician. What's at stake here? Well, of course, it's the future of IBC and demands for electoral reforms. That is the questions of who should organize the elections, how and when. To start with the latter, the Constitution states that new elections should be held within 60 days of the annulment, which gives the deadline of 31st of October. The IBC quickly gave the election date as 17th of October, but the opposition protested, saying it was too early, there was too much to change and reform. Of late, there are indications that the elections may not be held on the 17th after all. A date that has been mentioned is the 26th of October. Many reasons for that, but on the technical side alone, the provider of the electronic systems, the French company Safran Morpho, have indicated that they may not be able to deliver a new system in time. So what would happen if the elections are not held within the stipulated time period of 60 days? Now, that's a tricky one. The Constitution says nothing about such a situation, doesn't foresee it. So this would require political negotiations in an uncharted terrain. So who should run the elections and how? Well, broadly put, who, and that is the IBC, of course, but more specifically, which individuals there. The opposition's view on this rerun is that fundamental reforms are necessary. It argues that the Supreme Court ruling pinpoints the IBC or certain individuals therein with irregularities and illegalities. And NASA, the opposition coalition, has presented a long list of what it calls irreducible demands that need to be met for the opposition to take part in the election. Now, what they say is that they don't intend to boycott the elections. They are saying that if their demands are not made, there will be no election. There will be no election to boycott. It remains to be seen what means they will deploy in order to effectuate that. But that is what they say. So they want to seal all possible loopholes by introducing maximum transparency and accountability. Their demands include printing of new standardized election material through a new provider, a total overhaul of the ICT infrastructure, introducing a new group of non-partisan observers that are to sign off on the forms, replacing a lot of staff at the IBC, essentially at not the commissioners, because that's a more circumvented process, which is constitutional in nature, but at the secretariat, and pressing criminal charges against those key individuals in the secretariat that the opposition holds responsible for the bungled elections. Now, the government position, on the other hand, is there was nothing wrong with the August elections at all. So there's no need to change anything at the IBC. Elections will take place, and if the opposition doesn't want to participate, it's their problem. It will, of course, be easier for the government to hold on to that view and to block electoral reforms and to make political capital out of victimhood, so to speak, if the Supreme Court has been demonized in the first place. Now, the big question is, of course, how this political struggle will play out. By what means and how hard will the opposition push for its demands? And if at all, and to what extent, will the government concede to those demands? What is the view of the IBC itself? It's been moving back and forth. Their official line after the elections was that there will be new elections. They will be on the 17th of October, and we are on top of things. It is possible that we may need to make a few adjustments, but we'll just have to wait for the detailed ruling before we can say anything. However, over the course, during the course of the last few weeks, two internal but leaked memos written by the chair of the Constitution, Wafula Chebukati, one leaked 2 weeks ago and the other yesterday, reveal deep tensions. Chebukati accuses a number of people, including the CEO, Esra Chiloba, of serious misconduct. According to reports, staff were to be sacked. Both times there was swift denial from the IBC, so trying to paper over what is obviously tensions and mistrust within the Commission. So there's a tug of war and clear mistrust within the Commission, between the commissioners and the Secretariat, as well as among each category. And essentially, so far, no reforms have taken place in the IBC after the elections. What about the so-called international community? Now, Sirkku, will you speak something about that later on? Or? Yeah, we can yeah. Now, just a background, of course, as you may have heard, you know, the observer groups, the main observer groups, that was the ones that really matter, were the European Union one and the Carter Center. They have taken a lot of flack of recent after that ruling, of course, because they were seen to suggest that the elections were, if not free and fair, they don't use the F words, but by and large credible, you know. If not in the written preliminary reports, because these tend to be cautious and, you know, guarded and so on, as much as during press conferences and interviews and so on, they came out strongly, and many felt much more strongly than necessary to praise the IBC. And you saw the picture of John Kerry there, who went, many people would say, well beyond his call of duty in order to underline how well the IBC had conducted the work. And there are some clips where he said, really, it's not, you know, what matters are the actual paper ballots that people put in boxes and not some electronic transmission. A rather, you know, funny statement, one would think, coming from a person attached to the Democratic Party in the United States, saying that electronic transmission and such stuff does not matter for elections. Anyway, many people have felt the need to backtrack, and they did so immediately after the ruling, of course. And last week, the European Union Observer Mission, which is at least on paper independent of the European Union as such, came out with recommendations for the fresh elections, which are perhaps not as far-going as those of the opposition, but still pretty far-reaching. They stress that serious reforms are really necessary this time around. So one consequence of the perceived failure in August, I'm talking about the observers, is that they are likely to be much more vigilant next time around. So it will be more difficult to rig, at least in the same way as last time. Diplomats, on the other hand, what do they want? Well, they are likely to want to break the current standoff by breaking a deal acceptable to both parties, though right now it's not very easy to see what such a deal would look like, given what I've just said, how far the different parties are apart. But the problems need to be addressed. One cannot emphasize strongly enough how important it is that the fresh elections will be free and fair. Kenya has suffered from flawed elections for many decades. Very few individuals have been held to account. And the current situation is a direct legacy from 2007. Of course, there was international intervention then, there was a coalition government, there were a host of institutional reforms, but nobody was held to account for those elections which are today universally regarded as seriously rigged. No one. Okay, so what can we expect? We don't know exactly when the elections will take place. We don't know the exact personnel, the top personnel that will deal with it. We don't know the exact framework that will be used. But they will take place most likely sooner rather than later. So what can be expected about the campaigns? They are likely to be very tough and hostile. The elections and the ruling have polarized Kenya further, and it was pretty polarized before. Stakes have gone up even more. By and large, the electorate has decided. There are very few undecided voters out there. It will be a matter of maximizing the turnout in strongholds and, if possible, disenfranchise voters on the other side. The August election and the ruling will feature heavily. I was robbed of my victory, Uhuru will say. The government are thieves, the opposition will say. A lot of money and possibly violence, will be used. The precise way of influencing the election will depend on how tightly regulated and closely monitored the election itself can be expected to be. If very much so, very closely monitored, meaning rigging is made more difficult, parties will need to influence the outcome at other stages, as I said, turnout. Again, money and violence will be key means. In some opposition areas, government officials have already been accused of, and even caught, buying IDs and voters' cards. In central Kenya, the home area, so to speak, for the Kikuyu ethnic group, that is Uhuru Kenyatta's ethnic group, one should probably use the word notorious, Member of Parliament, Moses Kuria, Member of Parliament for Gatundu South, representing the President's own constituency, has repeatedly uttered controversial statements of late, and he has been charged repeatedly but never convicted of hate speech. Of late, he was caught, and there is recording of that, when he said, look, in the last election, only so and so many of us voted for the president. We will make sure that every one of us vote for the president next time around. And I even hear there were a number of thousand, I can't remember the exact number, who voted for the other devil. We shall find them and deal with them. And there were also graphic references to how they would circumcise men of the other related to the opposition. The Luo community is one of the few communities, ethnic communities in Kenya where men are not circumcised, and that has repeatedly been a case in this ethnic hate propaganda. So things might get bad. Okay. I think I'll stop there for the time being, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion, right?
Yes, I think so. Thank you, Anders, very much. And I think it's interesting when Anders, when you were saying that the voters have pretty much decided who they're going to vote for, but on the politicians they haven't. I mean, there's defections now from one camp to another and from party to another, and lots of it is also considered that there is lots of payments potentially and or intimidations to change the alliances kind of power balance, which is very interesting in Kenyan politics in general. But I think the Kenyans, I mean, are starting to get, and you know, the whole thing that's violence, that's what the media was asking, for example, us all the time. Is there going to be violence? Is there going to be killing? Is there going to be some chaos? And when I talk with my Kenyan colleagues, I mean, they were saying that, well, we are both that now. We are bigger than any politician in this country or one tribe, that we have to work together. Of course, there is many frustrated youth, poverty, especially in slum and the informal settlements, where it's very easy to recruit people to protest and make demonstrations and even to violence. But in general, what I've seen, I think the Kenyan general electorate are starting to see that we should not be used by our politicians. And I think that's really good, and that's really impressive. And even the fact that we are waiting, or they were waiting for the court cases, and very peacefully, besides the few little protests here and there, it shows that there is some trust that is built to the institutions also, because that has been the biggest problem. But I think this is all something that we can discuss together. We have also some other distinct colleagues here, Professor from Makerere, Professor Rukoko, who can also give the Ugandan perspective or comparison here, and several others who've been following these issues. So let me open the floor for comments, questions, anything that comes to your mind. Maybe.
As usual, please introduce yourself,
yes, exactly.
your name and where you're from.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the good.
Good. Speak up, please.
I think the microphone is not working.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the good lectures. I have questions toward the ethnic conflict in Turkana, and I want to know to what extent does this elections will affect the ethnic conflict in Turkana. And I have another question toward the oil extractions delayed. To what extent will this elections affect the oil extractions phenomenon, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should I wait for further questions?
Yeah, maybe. I saw two. There was Professor Rukoko and then Professor Adedula, our research director. I don't know who would be better with the microphone. Maybe Mark can, knowing. Okay.
I don't think I was first. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for your insightful lecture.
It's only for recording.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's only for recording.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but
No.
you should fix it in so that they can.
Oh,
But
okay.
speak louder.
Oh. I thought you mentioned very important issues about the elections in Kenya. But I wanted to add something that I was also interested in the elections in Kenya. Since I come from Uganda and they are neighbors, and most of the refugees ran to Uganda, and Uganda has been, a very good teacher to the Kenyans in one way or another. First of all, the question of money that was used, especially in 2013 elections, probably did not come out very strongly, but this was something that the way it was organized, because in Uganda that seems to be a very strong component of our elections. And there is close association between Uhuru Kenyatta and Museveni. And the way, you see, you group people, especially the poor people, and give them a lot of money, and you are able to mobilize support. But what is also, what I wanted to mention that, but two, is that there was close resemblance to the election that happened in Uganda, where the percentage, you see, from the beginning to the end, the difference was 10%. And I thought that what happened in Kenya was actually a lesson learned from Uganda. I wanted to mention that. And I think the Kenyan situation, the Kenyan elections are not yet concluded, especially when we don't know the fate of the Electoral Commission. Because whereas there is trust on the part of the opposition, I mean on the, by the way, I don't know who is trusting it, because the opposition thinks they need to be changed. But it seems the Jubilee, those in government, still think they should stay and do their thing. So if that is the situation, then we are likely to see more violence. I can see, unless that question is resolved, and resolved rather soon, we are likely to have a serious conflict. I don't know how, unless there is a resolution on that point, there's likely to be, because people cannot wait for so long. Very soon, power is going, I mean, there could be a vacuum. The Uhuru government may seem to be in charge, but people are tired. They want to see a resolution soon, and there's this question of damaging the reputation of the judges is intended to create confusion in the whole political environment, such that when there is confusion, then there could even be a coup. I can see those possibilities, because how are they going to resolve that question? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, let's take these three who were online and then. No, I think Victor was. Yeah.
My name is Victor Adituna. I work here at the Nordic Institute. And among other things, I also observe elections in Africa. Okay? So thank you very much. And just some brief interventions. I think for those of us who are looking at this, we're already celebrating in our hearts. Yeah, because when we look at where we are coming from to where we are today, that new trends are emerging that may form the basis for far-reaching reform in the electoral process across the continent. But let's be guided that it is the people themselves that can design, champion the direction of change. And that takes me to the second point, that there is a trend now that is challenging the ability and the power of the international community to confer legitimacy on regimes. And I think this is one direction we have to look and see that, look, the future of election in Kenya is not the one that is going to be dictated by any observer or any international community in any form itself. It is the dynamics within Kenya itself that will make this happen. Thank you.
I think we are we.
Yeah, him. Yeah, let's take him because he's been
finish.
waiting. You've been waiting since the beginning.
This will be a very different note, actually. My name is Sebastian Bay. I work for the Swedish Civil Contingency Agency. And
Okay.
I work with protecting the Swedish elections from influence operations. But I'm actually here in a private capacity for because I'm interested in the topic of Kenya per se, but also in how do we ascertain what actually happened. Because if we look at the Kenyan election, I think one thing that's quite distinguished is that there is a lack of primary data in regard to what actually happens. I mean, we have the primary forms from the election stations, the 40,034 A's, and and from the constituency level as well. But we haven't really looked at the primary data very hard. If you look at the point you made about the constant 11% gap, that is a wildly accepted statement nowadays, that there were an 11% gap. So I tried to check that. So I went through all the Facebook postings of everyone who copied or made a screen dump of the election commission's homepage during the entire process. And it turns out, and I gathered the data and sent it to you, it turns out that there was no 11% constant margin. It was actually a shifting margin. And the data that has been presented, it's from 2 hours during the middle of the night, where of course there was an 11% constant margin because most people were sleeping and they weren't counting votes. So my question is, or rather statement is, how can we support the Kenyan elections with enabling transparency and being able to answer up when these allegations come up? Because they live and they feed rumor and they undermine democracy. And we need to be more vigilant, I think, in being able to provide factual answers to what actually happened. So that's something I think we can discuss.
Yeah. You want to say something first?
Okay, I'll try. Thank you very much for good questions and some of them difficult questions. To start with the lady over there about Turkana, my short answer is to both your questions, I don't know. I don't know anything about the ethnic conflict in Turkana, and I don't know why oil is delayed. Perhaps anyone else knows? No?
Not directly.
Sorry. Okay. To Professor Okoku, money, yes, obviously a lot of money was spent. There was one issue during the court case, the petition, where the petitioners, the opposition, wanted the court to find the president guilty of misusing his position, including the use of public funds and personnel. Now, the ruling of the court was that they didn't find him guilty of that. Yeah, so there was no legal evidence to the extent that the court could establish that tied the government to an abuse of public funds. Now, of course, we know it happens, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can add to what you are saying.
Yes.
It happened in Uganda, and I personally went to the village and I found the money distributed, being distributed.
Yes, yes.
I almost wanted to say, can I get some? But I felt that was, not because I wanted that, because it was it. But
you remember this is streamed live all over the world now.
Oh, yes, it
that.
was distributed. Yes, I can testify to that. It was distributed across the country. But then when it came to court, it was never proved to be true. And I was surprised. I saw it with my own eyes.
Yeah, I don't really know how to respond to that, but I mean, there is that distinction between what you know by common sense and what you can establish legally. You know, how do you know the source of that money, etc., etc. But it's the money is one thing. There was one instance when in Kenya when Uhuru Kenyatta directed local administrative officers, so-called county chiefs, and chiefs at other levels, to promote the government during the elections, and saying that some of the equipment they had was Jubilee equipment. Now, that was clearly not the case, and that was clearly in violation of the law. I don't want to speculate because I don't, with regards to the court case, because I don't know what evidence that was provided. But everybody knows, of course, that that governments in Uganda and in Kenya abuse public resources during elections. It might be difficult to pinpoint. One should remember there was a headline last week, I think, that over the first, was it 6 months? Did anyone see that? Over the first 6 months this year, the government had borrowed a record 430 billion Kenyan shillings. That is roughly 40 billion Swedish crowns, 40 billion. And that was a record amount for that period of time. Now, that may or may not be related to the elections. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Did you have something?
No, I mean, did you, on that question?
On that particular question? No, but it's very interesting. I mean, this evidence. Nowadays, it's a little bit difficult because everybody has a mobile phone, and you can actually record things, and you can play them, and you can have them online, yet again, to this ICT use in also positive ways. But still, taking things into court and legally. I mean, in Kenya, 2003, around that time, Anglo leasing, corruption scandal, where many might know by name Chonki Donga, who actually taped some high-level government officials who were trying to get him into some corruption deals, and still that was not taken into court, that was not taking the case forward. How much evidence do you need? And it's a challenge. It's really a challenge.
Yeah, on the question, going on to Victor about the role of the international community vis-à-vis local society. Yes, I agree. The dynamics within the local society that will determine the outcome of the elections, and especially with regard to observers who come and go. I think if one wants to look at the influence of the international community, one should perhaps take a closer look then. And the potentially bigger problem might be the diplomatic community, because they are there constantly throughout, and they even though these election observer missions are formally independent, they operate within and understand the political dynamics within the scope provided by these diplomats from their respective countries. That's the reality. So, it's easy to bash observers, and sometimes it's fair and sometimes it's not. But they are used, and they need to understand that they enter into a highly charged context, and they must not be innocent, right? For example, in the Kenyan elections, they said afterwards, well, our preliminary statement, we didn't say, first of all, we didn't use the terms free and fair. We didn't give a complete thumbs up to the process. What we did was we reported on election day voting and polling station counting. Now, during the last two elections, that has not been the problem. And they know that, or they must know that. It's their job to know that. They must know that the problems have occurred during transfer and tallying, right? So that's what you would look for. So in a sense, if you want to put a hard question to them, why do you bother writing a preliminary report about election day? That's not important. Because if you do it, and if you present those reports during interviews and press conferences, 3 cheers for the IBC, to all intents and purposes, that will be used. Again, they must understand that. It's their job to understand that. Now, to your, sorry, I didn't catch your name.
I'm Sebastian.
Yeah, Sebastian. Sorry, I didn't. That question about rigor, about the accusations. Yes, I'm not. I won't enter into any debate about the 11% gap. That may or may not be plausible and so on.
Actual question is not interesting. The interesting is how do we ascertain and how do we provide the factual data that is needed
Yes.
to have a
Yes.
debate.
And the difficult thing here and I think it needs to be stressed, what would be the primary data for the Kenyan elections? Now, one would say, okay, we go to the form 34A. That is, there are 40,000 plus polling stations in Kenya, 40,800 or something. And for each of these polling stations, for each of these polling stations, there should be one form where the votes are counted and the counting of the votes are summarized for each election. But 34A refers to the presidential election. So if you look, each of these polling stations should have a form 34A. But it's not only the original paper form. The law ties that. It's a very specific mechanism, and I won't go into the details of it. But the significance, the law was changed fairly recently, and for a good reason. Because precisely as I said, the main problem with the Kenyan presidential elections had not been voting. It had been tallying and transfer. So in order to prevent manipulation during tallying and transfer, some activists went to court and won the case to the effect that the law now stipulates that the final results for the presidential elections are the ones declared at the constituency level. And there are 290 constituencies in Kenya. So what happens is that each of these polling stations they have this gadget, this electronic gadget, where they enter the correct figures. They submit these and the scanned version of this form 34A to the constituency level tallying center and to the national level tallying center at the same time. So you can cross-check then that the paper forms and the electronic figures correspond, and they are entered at the same time. That would be, foolproof. You can read more about how it worked technically. The only problem was it didn't happen that way. The transfer didn't occur that way, and that was one of the main reasons the Supreme Court nullified the elections. And it's not just, a technical thing like, okay, you should wait for even if that's not the case in Sweden, you should wait for red light before you cross the street on foot. It's not a thing like that. It was a thing of enormous magnitude. There was a very good reason the law was changed. And there was probably a bad reason why they didn't follow that law. So in essence, if you just have the paper forms, and by the way, when people have tried to examine the paper forms, including the technical team from the appointed by the Supreme Court, there are a number of problems with these forms themselves. Discrepancies, some of them have security features, some of them don't, some are signed, some are not, etc., etc. And precisely because time passed between the elections and the examination, who could trust these forms anyway? Anything could have happened. They could have been fabricated meanwhile, because not at the time of announcing the results, the Commission did not have all of the 34As. So a major problem with primary data in this case.
But there are more primary data than what you state. I mean, there were people working at the election. There are the actual ballots. They are signed by the party representatives. They could be interviewed. They could be asked whether or not it was true. I think this is enormously important, that at one point someone actually goes through the data and says, was the election actually rigged or not? And I think we could go a long way towards getting closer to that answer, because now we only look at what the register said about the forms. And there are many problems with the forms, not the least that they are carbon copy forms. There are 6 layers, and you sign the top layer, and everyone who's ever used a carbon copy form layer know what happens to the last layer. So much has been filled in afterwards, and there are many problems. I'm not saying there aren't. I'm saying there's a problem that we don't really have good data so that we can have an informed debate on this. We're always talking about secondary data and people that have stakes rather than trying to deep down and check. And we could do a preliminary study where you could take a random sample and interview everyone who's actually working at the polling stations and check is the data correct or not, and sum up and look at the constituency level and so on. So much could be done, but it's not being done, unfortunately.
No, I agree. And my argument was always it should have been done in 2007. But that the commission that inquired into that, the Kriegler Commission, stayed away from that. And I always argued that was a serious mistake.
And it's a shame that it's not being done by the observer groups either.
Yep.
And it hasn't been done by the local observer groups that was actually out there. We're at
Yep.
almost every polling station.
Yes.
So they could have.
And or the Kenyan media, for that matter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that's a very good point, because that's also a thing. How can you improve the observer mission, which was the other question here, and the primary data? I mean, yes, and there's been lots of calls, especially from the Jubilee supporters, saying, well, let's just recount the votes. That solves everything. Half of them are disappeared a long time ago, and some of them were there not anyway to start with. So you can't actually go to that primary data anymore, and the courts know that very well. But yes, it should be maybe something that during the observer mission could be thought how that could be improved, and there were so many spoiled votes also in this case, which is also debated, which was a bigger issue about civic education and how to even run the elections of so many layers on different candidates for different positions. The other comment I wanted to say, well, I think it was related to Victor's, when you talk about the international community, and that was already discussed quite a bit here, and I agree with Anders that observers and the diplomatic community are different things. That's actually almost embarrassing to look at the diplomatic community there, which gave very strong opinions right after the elections and were quite a bit on the side of the observer missions, and now they are kind of pulling back and changing their statements, which they issue almost every time there is a new development, and it seems to be changing from a different position all the time, so it doesn't really kind of gain the confidence to how the international and diplomatic community works in the country. And during the transmission of the results and the results coming in, there were many conspiracy theories also going on, that Americans are working together with the Jubilee government because they want to keep Somalian troops and Kenyan cooperation with the businesses, and then there were other type of conspiracy theories, and that's related to what Sebastian, you were also talking about, the fake data and fake news. I think this year, particularly during the Kenyan election, there were so many different fake news and fake documents, and one side and the other, and many of them looked very official. So I mean, it's really, really difficult now to even know what is the real news and where do you get the real information. And what Victor was saying also about the African electorate making their own decision, and I think in Kenyan case it's this ethnic loyalty is a tricky one. I talk with many Kenyan colleagues and they say, well, we are not really ethnically voting, but then on the other hand, it's in lack of better choices, because if you look at the political ideologies or what the political parties represent, they don't have any consistent political ideology as such, and they change the alliances, and the former enemies are together, and then they split again, and then they make a different alliances. So what can the voters hang on to? And because the elections are still quite a bit like the winner takes it all, the only thing you can kind of hang on to is, well, at least my ethnic brothers and sisters will deliver something to my community, because otherwise there's nothing coming to my way, because there is no consistent policy issues. Yes, anyway, so that's the one problem over there also when it comes to this voting on what basis? And if ethnicity is replacing ideology, it's very sad, because that would mean that the politicians should really look seriously, how do we go forward from here? And it's kind of like a hostage situation. The voters are kind of hostage of the leaders, and then the leaders, on the other hand, in lack of better plans for the future, are relying on these kind of ethnic loyalties, to say. Yes?
Yes, my name is Susanna Dukaric. I work at the communications unit here at the Institute. And we have a viewer on Facebook who actually has a question regarding the ethnic aspect. He's asking about the ethnic conflict in Turkana. Can you comment on that?
We just had a question before on the ethnic conflict in Turkana, and I said I don't know anything about it. I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Maybe if I should.
but
If you know anything about it, please respond.
It's not specifically, but Turkana is one of those battleground states. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
in
true.
that sense, it's interesting because Turkana and some parts of the coast and some part are not traditionally aligned to either side. So there has been a lot of money and a lot of debate, but because they're voting more unevenly. But I don't have any insights on that either. But it is an interesting way to look at the fringe areas, for
Okay.
sure, to understand the election process as a whole.
Yeah, no, it's true. Now, I saw some hands up there on the back.
Thank you for your presentation. And my name is Nancy. My name is Nancy Rushohora. I'm a postdoc at the Makerere Institute of Social Research and a guest researcher at NAI. My comment or question, if you can just respond to it, I'll appreciate, is how the Kenyan election was conceived or was a motivation to other African states. For example, immediately after the election was nullified, Thabo Mbeki was a disgrace to South Africa. Everyone was saying, what did he really observe? Back to Tanzania, Zanzibar, Jecha, who nullified it, who promoted Shein as president, was said, hey, this is another disgrace. So Kenya had made Africa proud, not even Kenyans only, but Africa at large as proud. So these challenges of re-election and this really didn't matter. What mattered was that at least a nation in Africa has nullified the election, gave voice to opposition parties. So I just wanted you to comment something on that.
Hi, thank you. My name is Misha. I'm an intern here at NAI. My question, it builds off something both of you already touched on, and it's the Kenyan people and their willingness to show up to the election. And it's a bit of a running joke that how can Kenya be so good at voting but so bad at counting the votes? And my question is just in the trust in the actual electoral process as a whole. And like you said, that almost every single election in Kenya's history has had some type of discrepancies. There hasn't been, maybe the last election was probably the most fair in that sense. And this election was almost, if you will, a final test to see if the country was able to run a fair election, and one that they obviously failed at. And I'm just wondering about the trust in the actual electoral process. Will this have any bearing in the Kenyan people's willingness to actually show up and vote in the future? And my second question or point is obviously focus has been on the two main candidates, Raila Odinga and Kenyatta. And I'm just wondering about maybe the independent individuals who stood up, maybe not at the presidential level, but maybe at the governorial positions, and the campaigns that they've run and the groups that they have reached out to. There is a couple who have managed to galvanize a youth vote in a way that hasn't really been done before. And I was just wondering if these independent candidates will, maybe not soon, but in the future, be able to challenge the political elite that has really taken hold of political power. Thank you.
Just a statement on what Sebastian just raised. I think we are in the context where our international friends are pushing us seriously towards this electronics or mechanizing the electoral system, and I think it's good. I think I share your concern about data-driven election management and administration. I mean, it's super, it's fine. But if we conceive the electoral system as a subsystem within the larger system that is suffering seriously with respect to data collection and the use of data, then there's a huge problem that we really need to solve. I still agree with you, and I share that prescription that if we are going that direction, there is need for consistent support before we can get there. Now a statement on ethnicity. I am from Nigeria, and you know we have a lot of experience when it comes to elections in all shades. Yeah. I think before we, in a haste, make conclusion about ethnicity and ethnicization of election process and result, let us appreciate the community. My former president in Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, said something after the 2007 election, that there are communities, regardless of what the political ideology of political parties are, have resolved within themselves that these candidates will represent us. And when it is a community resolve, it subsists, regardless of the position or the formal regulation. I just think there's need for us to factor this reality into our analysis of trends in African elections. Thank you.
Should we take one more, or should we answer? One more, and then we
Thank you. My name is Gunnar. I'm a PhD student at the University of Iceland and currently visiting here at NAI. My question just relates a little bit to what's already been discussed about the trust of the people in the election. I'm more wondering about the next election that's coming up very quickly. Are there any indicators that this will be different from what we've seen before and that it can be trusted?
Okay, you want to start?
Well, okay, I can say something briefly. That's a very good question. It will be really interesting to see. I mean, I think Anders was already talking some of that during his presentation. It is really difficult to see how, first of all, time-wise, it will be even handled as is planned, and with the same electoral commission that is now getting all the blame, even from the Supreme Court, which is clearly blaming most of the problems on this electoral commission. And that's a commission that didn't have much trust of people to start with, because it was seen impartial till former elections, actually 2 former even and several earlier elections. So, I mean, me personally, I see it very difficult, the situation. How would people trust that it would be run by the same actors? And the president's side still having all the access to public resources and control of the state institutes, including the security agent and then the resources. And then, you know, I don't have an answer to that, but if I was a Kenyan who is going to vote, I would have a very difficult time to trust. But I think, on the other hand, like you were saying here, that Kenyans are very keen on voting. I can see them going back there and showing what they want to see as the results. Do we end in the same kind of situation again if the elections are actually held as planned on 17th, which I think many of us doubt? It's difficult to say, but yeah. But anyway, so that's the one thing. But I wanted to say something related to that also, the rise of the independent candidates, which you were talking about, which was quite interesting. Now there were in several positions, also the independent ones. And I had a colleague, young Kenyan politician, who wanted to form a party which is based on the independency of the candidates and no ethnic kind of liaison or as such. And he had, the party is there, but it's very hard to get enough support to that. And even the people who say that we don't want to vote with along the ethnic lines, they say, yes, but we can't vote for that because it doesn't represent anything. Even if it does, it's one of the only ones that has values and principles and party, kind of like a policy direction. But I think you're right that it's rising up and slowly maybe there are more independent candidates who can get more support. But it seems like, you know, in Kenyan politics, not even in politics, in the whole public service and government, it's the same faces and same figures who just change position from earlier, from 2002, from the civil society to government and different government offices, and the politicians who are the main candidates, they change alliances and their collaborators, but it's still the same ones. Maybe it's the next generation, your generation, that is going to make the big change here. And then I think also, yeah, for the electronic system and the ICT and failing it, and there's I think in this case the international community has a little bit embarrassing situation, because it was the big US, UK, EU giving lots of support building this system and making it unriggable system, and now it seems that that system is the biggest problem in these elections. And now how do you deal with that situation then? It's a tricky one. And then about the ethnicity, one other thing is, like I said, that I think in Kenya and elsewhere people would not like to hang on to voting on the based just on the ethnic choices, but the politicians are so good at manipulating ethnicity, and especially with the youth, and especially those who may not have many other employment opportunities or other ways to get their voices heard. I think that's the biggest problem, the manipulation. But now people see through it, I think. But how do you break that kind of vicious cycle? That's really the challenge.
Okay, I'll answer to the same question, but I'll give a different answer because I have a different view on the relation between ethnicity, politics, and content in Kenya. So it's a big, you know, I'll try to be brief, but I have a different perspective. Now, when you posit ethnicity against ideology, I don't think it's true theoretically, and I don't think it's true in the Kenyan context. It's partly true, but it's not completely true. Because voting along ethnic lines is theoretically, of course, does not exclude content or ideology or any such kind. You know, you have regional parties all over the world which are both strong on identity, have very pronounced identity, but have particular political issues and ideologies even, you know. And what matters tend to be, and in some societies, mobilize, you know, political cleavages and lines of mobilization differ between societies for historical reasons. In some societies it's class, some religion, is some region and ethnicity. Nothing strange about that. For historical reasons, ethnicity and region has become very pronounced and strong in the Kenyan case. We could talk about the reasons for that another day, but it is very pronounced as compared to most other African societies I know of. And there are ethnic voting blocks, there are deep divisions and polarizations and mistrust between ethnic groups, but that does not mean, that is not the whole story. Not all, I mean, some political parties are exclusively ethno-regional vehicles, but not all. Most politicians can be described or reduced to opportunistic manipulators, but not all. It's simply not true to describe them in equal terms. You know, the historical record speaks, and we can have a long discussion about the distinction between those parties. But I think that there are examples in Kenya as well of political parties with a nationwide reach and membership who are not, you know, textbook pure, but contain partly ideologies. And the two political alternatives in Kenya differ very clearly, as do their presidential candidates, with respect to important political issues, such as centralization, decentralization, which is, in the Kenyan context, a debate on how to allocate and distribute resources. So it's, I'm just making the case here. Don't dismiss the content dimension of Kenyan politics or even Kenyan political parties. It is there. And so, I'm not sure about the independence. There are many different layers of this. You know, one dimension was after the primaries, when, you know, losers came out as independents, and that may have more of an intra-party dynamic than anything, you know, genuinely substantive. Of course, there have been attempts by people like Boniface Mwangi in Nairobi to stand as he stood as MP for Starehe, but lost, and so on and so forth. Again, I don't think one should romanticize these. You know, that there are always stories, as far back as I can remember, that this time we will have a genuine grassroots social movement rising from Kibera and, you know, transforming the political landscape. But perhaps precisely because I don't like to speak of the political elite in singular in Kenya, because I think there are very significant differences within this elite. So I don't want to posit the political elite against independents or outsiders as such. I remember in 2013, people, you know, saying, bandied about, oh, Martha Karua and Peter Kenneth, those are the, they were not in, they are the political parties. Oh, they are, you know, Raila and Uhuru are just, you know, ethnic barons and whatever. Martha Karua and Peter Kenneth, those are the true voices, and not so much. You know, you can trace the careers of Martha Karua and Peter Kenneth since the 2013 elections and see how independent of ethnic loyalties they really were. Not that independent. So it's a long story, and I could go on and on. So there might be change, but I don't think it will come from independence. I think it will have to come from within political parties. But again, on my part, I don't want to idealize political parties. Many of them, and many large parts in all of them, are precisely what people dismiss them to be. So, but I just want to point out there is a difference, and we should hold on to that.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, we have some time.
Yeah, my name is Charity Resian. I come from Kenya, and I'm a master's program student in Uppsala University. I just wanted to add on something to do with independent candidates. Right now, like in the past election, like the current one that was nullified, we had a lot of independent candidates who won at the county levels. Very young candidates, as young as 23 in campus, you know. So like, I think the young generation with time is really coming up, and I'm hoping that the same fact that the communities feel that, you know, they don't really need to be in any political party to select, to elect somebody. I mean, I feel like maybe with time that will go to the presidential level. So yeah, I'm still having some hope in that.
Yeah, I think that's a good remark, and I think that there have been hopes that, okay, with devolution, the presidency will matter less. So far, that's not the case. I mean, the presidency is still by far the most attractive position, and the presidential election is by far the most important. But you see trends as those you point out at the local level, where you know, dynamics have been introduced to you know, cynics have pointed to it's just a decentralization of corruption. Not necessarily. It is that partly, but not, you know, there are also counter tendencies of people, you know, not voting 6Ps or whatever, that is voting for the same party all across, but actually can vote for candidates of their choice, even though it's not that same party. So, yes.
Okay, somebody else? Yep, Professor. Okay. We have a few minutes.
Yeah, just one small thing, and I wanted to respond to who is going. Yeah. You know, he was making a point. I'm sorry to take you back to the question of observers. Election observers, my view is that if suppose they had said the election was unfair, and without the court intervention, what would it have created? In Uganda, they made it very clear that the elections was not free and fair. And the man is still there, and he's even doing whatever he wants to do. So when you are saying that the external, it doesn't matter what they say, but the elections in Africa will be determined by the communities. Yes, the external observers, what can they do? That's that's what I say. They can say anything, but they won't change much.
Yeah, but I think that's a really good point, because this is more about the whole democratic system. And when I was listening to court decision today, also, I mean, the judges were pointing a lot that voting is election a process, and it has many different parts, and the context have to be taken into account. And that's the whole thing. I mean, is it enough to have elections if we know what the outcome is, or if the international community is going to, in the end, anyway have to go, no matter how rigged the elections might have been? Like in Ugandan case, it's a quite good example, and business as usual continues with the aid community and all this. And then many times, like Uganda might be a good example, the elections can be just used to legitimate the man in power. And you say we had the elections, they were credible enough, and therefore we move on. That, and Rwanda just now close to 99% on Kagame's side, where the opposition didn't really have a chance to get support to their candidates. So I think that's the wider question of the elections. And I think Kenya is a very interesting case here, because Kenya is so dynamic, and the alliances are changing, and it's very exciting, and it's always quite on the edge. Is it close enough? And now that the fact that the petition was taken to court, and court made a decision that was maybe unexpected and showed some independence. So I think it's kind of like giving direction also to, in general, what's happening wider in Africa, going away from the Ugandan type of elections. And also what you were saying, I think that was very interesting and very good. I think it's a very good point that, and both of you are young, and you are the next generation, or this generation already, you are here and voting, and showing people that you can break that kind of tradition of the party politics and based on certain alliances, and you can get elected, and you will have more voice and bring new things to the agenda. I think that's really important, and I think that's the one good thing that the Kenyan new constitution was bringing when it was devolving the power. The presidential elections are in their own category, but then the county level and over there is much more, I think, dynamics now, and the division is not so clear at the county level, not even when it comes to the alliances. I think, county level, Jubilee, Nasa, they are more, balanced in many places. And they can, and I think they can work together.
Not in all places,
Yeah.
It really depends. There are some strong, it's not in all places. It entirely depends on what area the constituents or the county is. There are some counties that are entirely on the stronghold of NASA or Jubilee. So you get in such counties that Jubilee party is really, really well voted, compared to the NASA party. But still, in the same counties, you get some independent candidates coming up and winning the same post, maybe MP, being MPs, or, for the governor, it's more of you have to have a political party that is really well off, known in the area. So, yeah, it doesn't really matter so much at the county level in terms of political parties. It's not like really it has to be Jubilee or NASA,
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting development. Now, is there somebody who still needs to say something urgently? Because I see that we are losing some of our audience because it's getting to be close to 5. Yes, if not, we thank you again for coming here and also contributing in this discussion. We yet again apologize that our program was a little different than planned, and I've been here on the computer hoping that I could get Francis still online. He has gone back to the village because he was so disappointed that he couldn't make it here, and it's raining and the internet is not working properly, so unfortunately he will not be able to join us today, but maybe we can get him another time. The reason why we had this discussion here today was that he's here for another seminar, which he's also now going to miss, which is very unfortunate. But I think the fact that independent academics are not allowed to board to the airplane to go to an international conference, it tells you a lot how tense things are in Kenya at the moment, without president's permit. Okay, so thank you very much.